Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Not podcast. I am Michael Mandel, your host and co-founder and CEO of CompStack. And today I have with me Greg Katz from Esri. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Absolutely. Thrilled to have you. And would love to kick it off here, send it over to you, have you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got to be where you are today, and then we'll dig in a little further.
No, thank you. I'm not going to go all the way back, but I did grow up a retail kid. My family had a jewelry and gift business here in Atlanta, and I used to run the aisles of that growing up, and eventually it turned into a catalog showroom that sold out to service merchandise back in the day. So I kind of transitioned after school when they sold the service merchandise. I really didn't have, thought I was going in the family business, so I really didn't have much to in terms of pathway to a career. So jumped into the restaurant business for a while and was in the restaurant and convenience business for a long time, and then decided if it seemed too easy, so I decided I'd start my own restaurants. And that was a very interesting scenario, and I call it my second MBA. It really taught me a heck of a lot in a very short period of time. So eventually sold out of those after about 5 years. We got to 6 or so locations and sold out the business actually piece by piece or location by location, and then thought commercial real estate might be a really interesting venue to try because I had really enjoyed the site selection aspect of the restaurants. And so moved into brokerage at the shopping center group for about 5 or 6 years. And then I think because I was the only person to have an iPhone at the time that knew how to use it, they decided I might be good for the technology research and data side. And so moved over to, at the time, Director of Innovation and Technology. And then shifted into a chief strategy officer role over there, where we developed some really interesting data and technology capabilities for the commercial real estate industry. And then did a short tenure at Retail Stat, which is also a real estate and retail data company, and then recently joined Esri, which has been really interesting. I've been an Esri user at times. We've been an Esri partner back at my shopping center group days. And so moved over to Esri in what's called Industry Solutions. And basically I serve as a subject matter expert on the real estate side for both internally looking at how we market and teach and educate the client base, as well as internally as we look to grow the real estate offerings and better meet the real estate client needs.
Why don't you tell us just quickly, what is Esri?
So most people think, and that's a great question. You know, it's funny because we talk about this all the time in the real estate world. I think people just think of Esri as maps and mapping software. But you know, Esri really is it's a geospatial platform that can do a lot more than just mapping. It's a lot of visualization and imaging and analytics and use of data. And so Esri really is a powerful platform that deals with everything about location, across the globe. And so it's been really interesting to kind of get a look under the hood and see what Esri's all about from the inside.
What does it mean to be the retail industry, real estate guy there?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think, Esri got to what they call commercial, or the commercial segment and sector, kind of later in its life cycle. It started, mostly with government, utility, municipality, environmental, et cetera. And when I was over the shopping center group is when they were just starting to get into the commercial side of the business. So it really is having a lot to do with data translation, information translation, product translation, as it applies to real estate uses, and that's both internal and external. So spend a lot of time creating information about how to best address the different personas that exist in the real estate world, because as you know, there's an awful lot of differences between who you talk to and what you talk to them about, and so spend a lot of time doing that as well.
Got it. Cool. Well, you're more of a retail expert than me, so I'm gonna. Well, why don't we talk about retail and you can be smart. Let's get a sense of where retail is today, because everybody was talking about the death of retail pre-COVID, right? Everybody was like, retail's dead. Everybody's doing all their shopping online. Nobody has any interest in going to stores anymore. And so, I was watching as these, public retail REITs were just plummeting. Terrible market. In fact, I bought some of these REIT stocks thinking this is the bottom. This can't get worse. And then of course COVID happened, and then COVID happened, and then people are like, yeah, we said retail was dead, but now it's really dead.
Right.
But doesn't seem so dead anymore, right? So what's happened in retail, and how's the world of retail shifted since then?
So it's interesting. I think to a certain degree, retail was just starting pre-COVID to go through its venture into experiential, right? And as it started, I think obviously, and you mentioned COVID interrupted a lot of that innovation, and retail had to rethink itself and feel and look at how did it bring people back into stores as we got out of COVID, and what is it going to take? Everyone had gotten used to, the old doom scrolling, right? And a lot of that was doom shopping too, where they were just shopping away because they were bored and didn't have anything to do. And so, online did surge, and it brought its own unique set of challenges to retail, because a lot of these retailers had to shift from what they knew as brick and mortar to having such a strong e-commerce presence. And then, right, when everybody came back into the fold and said, hey, we can go out again, let's go out and start shopping at physical stores, everything had to shift again, and they had to reshift their focus. And so a lot of movement towards experiential, a lot of movement towards the customer experience. But I think harmonization is kind of how the word I've used to sum up where retail's been in the last few years. And that is a harmonization of being everywhere the customer wants you to be. So wherever the customer wants to transact, retail needs to be there. And I think the evolving retail today is a lot about evolving to look at this more holistically, look at e-commerce as complementary to brick and mortar and physical, and complementary to mobile ordering or buy online, pick up in store, or at the curb, or whatever the case is, even delivery. And I think it's more how you can serve the customer where they want to be. And brick and mortar is a huge, huge part of that, because you can't, again, touching and feeling the product and experiencing what it can do, and the socialization that we now find in a different perspective post-COVID. You can't get that from just brick and mortar, right? And so it's really that holistic approach to looking at retail that's kind of taken and transformed the industry in the last few years.
What does that mean from a practical standpoint as it relates to, who our listeners are, who are probably real estate people? Some of them, invest in real estate or in real estate brokerage. What are the types of retail assets that are flourishing as a result of this shift in the retail market, and what are the kinds that are struggling, and why do you think that is?
So I think a couple of things. I think one is that to a certain degree, I think space size is shrinking. But I would argue it's really selling space size, right? And people are innovating with back of house being both from a distribution or last mile perspective. So the evolution of that store has changed. And I think that means that, from an investment standpoint, even the shopping centers have changed. You have to look at making sure it can accommodate that last mile plus, the existing in-store inventory and employee experience. And, at its core, the one stable thing through all of this has kind of been grocery anchored centers. And they seem to thrive no matter what. They seem to thrive in this world where there's uncertainty, because it's such a staple and, a staple item, the grocery, and everything around it tends to service that grocery customer in a lot of respects, whether it's the Chinese restaurant or the dry cleaner or the exercise studio or whatever it is. So I think that held up really well and continues to hold up. But I think we're seeing a resurgence in malls. We're seeing a ton on the data center side, obviously, with everything that's going on with AI, et cetera. I think industrial is shifting. I think it was a little overbuilt from the e-commerce side of the equation as we went through COVID. They, more and more warehouses need them now. And I think now we're kind of seeing a little bit of a backtrack. And I think multifamily kind of got overbuilt a little bit too. But from a retail perspective, I really continue to think it's the grocery anchored and the resurgence of kind of the lifestyle center from an experiential perspective. And, if anything is, quote unquote, suffering at all, I do think that some of the freestanding is having a little bit of an issue. But I do think convenience retail and grocery retail are strong.
So you mentioned, grocery anchored retail as being something that's always been strong. And yet, what we're seeing from our prospective clients and our current clients is they are all asking about grocery anchored retail now in a way where it feels different than in the past. Like where yeah, maybe it's always been strong, but right now that seems like that's what everybody wants to invest in. Grocery stores are serving the same function as they did in the past. If anything, people are buying more groceries online than before, Now, granted, it's not just about the grocery store, it's about the shopping center, but what is it that makes grocery anchored shopping centers, a sexier asset class to invest in today than, call it, pre-COVID?
I think the biggest piece of that is grocers as a whole. There's been some consolidation or attempted consolidation in the industry, but the grocers as a whole tend to be strong financially and tend to go where the population is migrating to. I mean, we used to joke that, if you see that Publix is in an area or looking for at specific sites, that tells you that they know that the population is starting to migrate out there, and they'll buy 2 or 3 years ahead of that migration. And by the time they're open, they're just ahead of that curve. And so I think it tells, grocery anchor tends to be, new grocery anchor tends to go with the trends and the demographics and what's happening, kind of boots on the ground. Existing grocery anchor, everybody needs to eat. And regardless of what's happening in terms of recession or boom times or, even COVID, the grocers in a lot of respects, even if it was delivery, stayed open, right, to handle the base necessity. Mm-hmm. And I think you're seeing too, grocers are becoming, in a lot of respects, are becoming restaurants as well. And they're doing a lot of, pre-prepared meals, in-store dining, pickup dining, et cetera. So they're starting to, it's becoming more share of stomach than just grocery, right, and staple items. And so I think that allows you to have a good foundational base for your center, your retail center. And, there's enough co-tenancy synergy that usually those centers are typically full, right? And you don't have to worry. So the return, and the ROI on those is always going to be there, I think, because of that.
During COVID, we saw this huge surge in, medtail, right? The medical retail, all these urgent care centers opening everywhere, maybe at least in part because so many other retailers were closing shop, and so they would, they could get good deals on that space. Is that a trend that you see as something, as a permanent shift? Are we seeing those close up shop? Where do you see that industry going?
I continue to see what started with mostly, to your point, what started mostly with urgent care, I am now seeing branch out into more medtail. So you're seeing, satellite offices for doctors and hospitals. You're seeing the dental coming more main. Aspen Dental was one of the first to do this, but, front and center locations, right? But you're seeing more medical take a lot of those spaces. And I think there's a couple of reasons for it. One is they can take the less attractive spaces, right? Because this is a destination location in a large respect. So, it's a natural fit in that regards. Usually the parking is there. And if it's done right, it's in the lesser trafficked areas, there's more parking available, and there's usually longer park times for those clients as they come in and they're not running in and out of a dry cleaner or something like that. But I think that all of these asset classes are starting to morph together. And so you're seeing, hotels, more so than ever, anchoring malls. You're seeing, fitness centers anchoring malls. You're seeing experiential offerings, anchoring malls now, and, apartment complexes where you didn't ever see that before, right? And so I think as these asset classes continue to morph, it's really about highest and best use. And so medtail, I think, is not only here to stay, but I think you'll see a lot of creativity continue, especially with some of the office conversions that are taking place and going to multifamily and some of the other stuff. I think you'll see these folks start to look at strip centers and malls and things like that as another place to locate.
What do you think about co-working in retail? We've seen Industrious in particular as brought some of their locations to malls and places like that. Is that you see that as a trend?
It's an interesting one because I think it kind of depends on where we end up with this hybrid work environment, right? And I don't know that we fully settled in one way or the other yet, but the return to office is definitely there in some way, shape, or form. I do think hybrid is continuing to dominate. And, even if it's just 1 day a week out of the office and 4 days in, it's still hybrid. And the co-working gives people the ability to office and stay focused and not have all the commotion of home and still, perform some of those hybrid functions. And so I don't know if they'll still be growing as quickly as they were, through and coming out of COVID, but I think they still provide a interesting base for retail in the sense that those people shop and grocery shop, clothes shop, entertainment shop, either before or after, or even sometimes during work. And so it does give a great co-tenancy, cross-tenancy scenario other than the parking issues.
What about like, high street retail, right? Where have you been seeing trends in that area? Obviously, it's a different dynamic. A lot of times, some of those locations are as much about branding as they are about shopping, right? How have you seen that trending with your clients?
I've seen a lot of. It's interesting. I think high street used to be synonymous with luxury and luxury only, right? And now I think high street has changed to where you're seeing a lot of the direct-to-consumer or e-commerce based brands looking for, you mentioned marketing, right? Looking for that big presence and getting both marketing and trial. And so a lot of the trendy e-commerce seem to be, loving the high streets and being very successful in doing so. And so I think it's evolving somewhat where it doesn't just have to be a luxury lineup of tenants, and it can be some interesting and unique restaurants and, those e-commerce brands that are trying to start making a brick and mortar presence, along with a lot of these, these trendy fads that can kind of keep high street spaces occupied. It doesn't take long for a fad to kind of come into play nowadays and boom on, through social media or something like that. And I think you see a lot of that translate into some of those spaces as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've seen it firsthand. We have an office in Venice Beach, and right by Abbot Kinney, and Abbot Kinney is just filled with these retail spaces that otherwise are just online, right? You don't see them anywhere else, but you see them on Abbot Kinney. You see some of them actually by our office in New York as well, because we're on 6th Avenue, which is the Ladies Mile, which is where the really, really big box stores are in Manhattan. But then, one block over on 5th Avenue is where you've got, the smaller retailers, and just so happens in the neighborhood where we are, near Flatiron, that's where a lot of these, e-commerce stores tend to be, e-commerce, started stores, I should say, tend to be, versus more of the luxury that's further uptown on 5th Avenue. So
no, right, and it's, and a lot of that high street, you are dealing with, yes, expensive rents, but you're also dealing with, in a lot of cases, smaller spaces, or the ability to do things like pop-ups and make it real innovative from a marketing perspective. And so, you can test the waters in a lot of respects and get a high diversity of customer base, because it is, high streets tend to also be tourist attractions, right, from the shopping experience. So you get to get a little bit of everybody in there, and you can start seeing who's your customer and what are they buying, and does this have more appeal, more mass appeal, and then you can make real estate decisions off of that.
So what are the kind of challenges that you're helping your clients with on the retail side at Esri?
So I think it's a couple of things. One is there's a lot of, at least I'm seeing a lot of data fatigue out there. And then by that, I mean, there's become so much data that, and I looked at a chart of, from a real estate perspective, I looked at a chart like somebody had a real estate technology landscape, and it was this big infographic. And I looked at one from 2018 and, had all these names on there. And then I looked at one that was done at the end of 2024. And it's like twice as condensed with so much, and so you see all of this data, all of this technology coming into play. And I think it's confused the industry a little bit, and it's confusing as to what I need to use and when I need to use it. And, it's one of those, I can afford anything, but not everything. Right. And so people get real confused about, in the same respect as highest and best use in real estate, it's kind of highest and best use in data too. Right. And so we spend a lot of time, I think, looking at storytelling using maps as that visualization, right, and as that base. And what's the best way to tell those stories, and to tell those stories to those different real estate personas and audiences. And so a lot of what I'm seeing is, the C-suite or the real estate committee wants to see one thing, the transactors, the brokers, whoever, want to see it differently. The client wants to see it a little bit differently than that. And, so there's multiple stories to tell. And, it used to be you used kind of the same visualizations to tell it. And now we're starting to see these things being more dynamic and more crafted to each of these personas. And so we're seeing a lot of that. And then obviously we're seeing, the old buzzword of AI. We're seeing a lot of people trying to figure out how to incorporate AI. I see a lot of that in we want to get the answer as quickly as possible. And I think people are starting to realize that's not always the best scenario and the best situation.
Right,
and so
right.
Taking a step back and looking at how, in our case, we call it geo AI. And so it's the geospatial AI component, and again, that visual storytelling, how I can best use that to do what I need to do and to transact or to, de-risk the investment.
Do you find that there are particular challenges in, the geospatial representation of retail as compared to industrial, as compared to office, multifamily, other asset classes? What's unique about retail, and is it more or less challenging?
I think it's more, and that's not any disparity on the other asset classes at all, because they each have their own challenges. But I think when you're looking at retail, this is kind of how I look at it, and this is oversimplifying it, I know, but I think you can look at many of the asset classes almost in 2D, and retail you kind of need to look at in 3D. There's so many components from a retail perspective, both the site characteristics, right, ingress, egress, and visibility, and all of these things, right, that you don't really care about with things like industrial, and, maybe a little bit with office, but not so much, et cetera. And then, you look and say, okay, I've got the site characteristics, but then I've also got consumer and consumer movement and, competition and things that, that all of a sudden, and even zoning and space constraints and all of these things. So I think that there's more variables that get taken into account, and how you show that and how you tell the story with that makes it a very complex situation. And I think that's why it looks to be much more complex than some of the other asset classes.
Yeah, and it probably lends itself much better for mapping than the other ones do for that same reason too, right? You really need to see the visualization of where are the roads and where are the entrances, and who's at the one end of the shopping center that maybe is going to be more appealing versus the other end that's less appealing, who's in line, versus corner, right? All those things really matter.
You're exactly right. And then you add to that, how's the consumer's path to purchase, and, how do we focus, what's the traffic look like on the roads, and are people going to pass 3 of my competitors to get to me, or are they going to stop at the competitors? And so to your point, really looking at that visually really creates a different dynamic. And that's why, I think it was, mapping has always been a core to retail real estate and foundational to telling the story.
So what are your favorite data sets to layer onto a map for retail, right? Because I've seen so many out there. There's people who are tracking foot traffic, other people who are looking at vehicle traffic. There's information on, proximity to other, competitors, or proximity to parks, or, whatever the case may be. Or maybe you're, overlaying information on credit card spend data, income of consumers and where they live, and the income of where they work, and proximity to their offices, proximity to their homes. There's lots of data sets you can layer on the map. Which are the ones what do you think are the most interesting ones that actually can really drive the most decisions?
I'm going to answer it and not answer it.
Okay.
Okay. So my not answer is it depends, because it really does. It really depends. A Costco is going to look at something very, very differently than, an AT&T that's looking to pop up a store, right? Or a children's apparel store, right? There's going to be these different needs. And so, even demographically, if you think about it, a children's store is going to care about, where are families and where's the population of, say, 0 to 9-year-olds, right? And so, versus a Costco, like, how can I get as many people as I can to want to, be members and be in my store? And then the grocery, what's the concentration of draw that I'm going to get? And so, but more holistically, I will say that I was very fascinated from the time it came out with the human movement data or mobile location data. That was fascinating to me because I think it took away some of the vagueness of the 3-5 mile rings and the drive times. And when you were looking at your trade areas, and the way I've always said this is imagine the 3-mile radius ring around a site as a puzzle, right? And so you're assuming when you run anything on that 3-mile ring, you're assuming that you're getting the entire piece of the puzzle, every single piece, to visit that location. But the reality is you're not. And so what you look at with some of the mobile data is you can start really narrowing down where your visitation's coming from. And so the analogy is you can pull pieces of the puzzle out where there's no visitation, right? And so what you have left of the puzzle is incomplete, but from a visitation standpoint is mostly complete, right? Because it's showing exactly where they come from. So your demographics in this corner of the trade area may be very, very different than this corner, and you're not just taking the average of that radius ring. And so that, to me, was a game changer from a data perspective because it allowed for people to see things and not just make these broad statements, right? It got us to narrow down. The other one that I really, really love, just because I think the information it can shed, is persona or segmentation data. Who the customer is, what their propensity to shop is, and what they like to shop for, and what their values are as people, right? And I think persona data is the only data set out there that's apples to apples across the country. Because if they're in a segment in Iowa and in Florida, they still behave very much the same way, even though they're, whereas in a demographic like income, like you mentioned in New York, right? Your New York $50,000 goes a hell of a lot less, less far than my $50,000 in Atlanta, right? Just inherently. So sometimes you can't really compare apples to apples, but with persona segmentation, you can.
And when you say persona segmentation, you're basically creating like a persona based off of certain characteristics of someone, like their age, their sex, their whatever. Like, what are the things that go into determining someone's
can be all kinds of different things. Like Esri has a segmentation called Tapestry, and it does deal with purchasing patterns. It deals with demographic traits and characteristics. It deals with urbanicity, suburbanicity. It deals with all of that. There's other segmentations out there that deal with, look at the social media postings and sentiment and check-ins and location, as well as website searches and things of that nature to see, what people are attracted to and follow and gravitate towards. And so it can be everybody kind of has a little different way of looking at it, but yes, you described it correctly holistically in that it's, combining a lot of different data sets and looking for the patterns in those data sets.
Got it. And you'd say that, these patterns don't necessarily correlate to kind of more the more basic things like income and age and gender. Is it more complicated than that?
It is definitely more complicated. It really starts to focus on, it allows you to look at people's values. Are they fitness buffs? Are they couch potatoes? Do they shop at Neiman Marcus or do they shop at Ollie's Discount? And it can go back and forth, and so it really gives you a good flavor, and you can really start to, marketing has always had these personas that they create when they're doing advertising, right? And this is kind of a deviation of that. It's actually used very much in advertising, but this is, looking at those consumers so that you can see who is my consumer and is my consumer in these areas that I'm going to so that I can draw more, right? And draw effectively.
Are you able to reverse engineer site selection decisions? Meaning, like, some companies are known for being really good at site selection, right? So, McDonald's has their own, methodology by which they think about it. Can you look at the data, see where they have locations, and back into what probably drove that decision?
Yes, what kind of the tangibles, right? There's the intangibles and the gut, it's the art and science, right? I think on the science you can. And we've done a lot of that, especially in my past lives too, where you look and say, maybe a new concept's coming in. And we mentioned e-commerce going to physical locations, right? And you're trying to figure things out. But so you look for somebody that's kind of got like characteristics. And it doesn't have to be exactly like you, but just as a starting point, right?
Sure.
And you actually go through that reverse engineering to see, hey, this is how they're doing things. This is what they're doing. So it's close to who we are and what we are. Let's look at now locations based on those factors until we get enough of a base of locations to then start making our own decisions. So I think you can on those tangible. I will say the art part of it is still such a big piece of the equation, and sometimes the gut, wins, and a lot of times the gut wins. And so, you're not going to ever get it exactly right, but I think you can get 80% of the way there.
So, I think one thing that's always interesting to see with retailers is that some retailers like to be right next to their competitors, and other ones don't want to be anywhere near their competitor. What drives those kind of decisions? Is it an industry thing? Is it just or is it something else really?
I think it's a learned through performance scenario and a cross shopping scenario, right? Mm-hmm. And so, we used to joke back when I was in the restaurant industry, you'd go and at a corner, you'd see a McDonald's, a Burger King, and a Wendy's on 3 of the 4 corners, right? And people be like, wait a minute, why would McDonald's want to be across from Burger King? And then you say, well, there's the fanatics, right, that will take a brand and, like in the case of a restaurant, eat there 5 days a week or whatever the case may be, right? But there's people that like to rotate. But, so as long as they're coming to the area, again, going back to that share of stomach, you have the potential to grab them as a purchase. Or if there's 3 people in the car, maybe you get one day, 2 the next, right? And so I think you find that it works. And then there's other cases where you can see that, people, as a great example is Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's is in a lot of cases near grocers, traditional grocers, and it's because they serve a niche need, right? And it's different. And so you see a lot of cross shopping between grocery and Trader Joe's, even though they theoretically offer a lot of the same things. And so I think you see learned lessons of how that works and how that doesn't from a competitive landscape, and it helps you make those decisions.
Right. But a traditional grocery store, I think, probably doesn't want to be near another grocery store, right? They're concerned about owning the trade area, as big of a trade area for themselves as they can, right?
Yeah. So it's funny. We did a study a couple years ago where we asked that exact question, but it was with Target. Target has a grocery component, and especially in their old super Targets. And so we said, what does it look like when a Target and a grocer are together versus when it's just a Target or just a grocer, right? And what we found was Target actually benefited from being, which you kind of can, it kind of goes if you really think about it, but they benefited from having a specialty grocer in the same in the same center as them, a Whole Foods, a Sprouts, Trader Joe's. They did not benefit from having a regular grocer. In actuality, neither did the grocer. They both, performance-wise, they both dropped, right? And so, whereas in the case where it was like a Whole Foods and a Target, they both went up. And so it was a benefit to both. And so, I think if you look at it, you can start to measure these things and look at the transactions and look at who the customers are and why they're cross-shopping and really get down to the nuts and bolts of it.
One thing that I found interesting in retail, we're in the comps business, right? And it's harder to get retail comps than office comps or industrial comps. It's not a unknown challenge, particularly because, the major retailers, they're very sensitive about their data. Unlike an office tenant where, my office lease is a small percentage of my expenses and my operations, for a retailer, your office space, your retail space is your business, right? It's so fundamental to what you do. So, sometimes we don't have as many retail comps in a given area as we would office. But one thing that I found super interesting about, our retail comps is that we hear from our clients, I'm looking to put a Lululemon in my shopping center, in San Diego. They don't want to just see the Lululemon stores though in San Diego or in Southern California. They say, can you show me the Lululemon stores for any location throughout the country? Which I think is really, really unusual, right? Because the rents theoretically could be wildly different in one location for another, and yet they don't care. Could you speak to that a little bit? Like, do comps just matter less in retail, or do they matter in a different way?
It's funny. And it's a great point because, retail. You mentioned retail comps are by far the toughest to get with any kind of accuracy, right? And I think a lot of it has to do with looking at kind of trying to average out the data as a whole. But I also agree, and maybe where you're going with this a little bit, and I've always looked at this. I don't think you can compare these and if you look at the whole country, there's so many different variables to your point. You could be on a high street in New York, or you could be in the suburbs in Atlanta, right? And it's going to be very different. So other than getting some average baseline and also looking at trying to gauge overall like operating expenses to your point, right? Because it's hard. That's kind of the unknown is, what does it look like from a occupancy expense perspective? I tend to think you should look at like comps. Yes, it could be if it's San Diego and those high rents, it could be in other high rent markets, right? But I would call it down to just those. And I always find it interesting how everybody wants to look at the kitchen sink because I think it kind of dilutes the data. It kind of goes back to that 3 Mile Ring argument I made, which, you get the average of that 3 Mile Ring, and that's not necessarily your customer. Kind of the same on the rent. A successful store, it rents one factor and it's a big factor, but, with higher rent, presumably comes higher sales and or less operating expenses or more all those fun things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we had a user that I was speaking with recently who's on the valuation side, and he was appraising I don't remember the name of it, a super premium high end shopping center in Miami area. And it's a very well-known place. I don't remember the name of it, though, so whatever. But in any event, he's trying to determine a value for it, and he needed comps. And, he said, actually, I didn't want any comps from Miami. I determined that our most comparable shopping centers that were of this similar quality were not there. There was a particular mall in Honolulu, Hawaii that was also super high end, and that's what he wanted to comp on. And he said, I went on CompStack. You had all these comps for this similar shopping center in Honolulu, Hawaii, and that's what I used to value this property in Miami. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. It's a very different animal in that regard.
It is, and because and it's going back to the complexity of retail, right? You have to look outside of it, and you have outside of that core, and you have to look for that model, and that's not always easy to find.
Yeah, and I think, the other similar challenge is even if you're a one-off retailer, for instance, we talked about grocery stores, right? If there is a given kind of like city that you want to have a grocery store in, and there's one available grocery store location, and it doesn't have competing grocery stores near it, you might be willing to pay double the rent that maybe you otherwise would think you should pay in that location to get that location, particularly, if you don't think there's going to be any competitors coming soon to that location, right? Because
absolutely. And there's also self-cannibalization, right? So, if you're a Starbucks or, some of the other fast feeders, or you're like a Supercuts or Great Clips type salon, right? Where the convenience is such a big piece of all of that. Maybe you want to take a site that cuts off your competition or prevents your competition from jumping in, right? And so, or maybe you want to be on both, you're okay cannibalizing yourself because you want to be on the morning side of the road and the evening side drive time of the road, right? So you're willing to pay differently to get that because it helps you. It's the 1 + 1 = 3, right? And it helps you overall.
Yeah. That's a really interesting calculus, right? Because when you're analyzing your performance of your locations, and you've brought down the performance of one, you've got two locations that are mediocre performers, and you have to understand that that's okay because you've prevented one from being a terrible performer that has to close. But it's a very interesting challenge, I think. And one that you've got to probably, I presume internally, these retailers who are making these decisions have to, prove internally to their other stakeholders why they did this and why that makes sense.
Exactly, especially if it was modeled and you had some predictive numbers out there and the strategy has changed, right? Or even the model has changed. Maybe you went from pick a number, a 40,000 square foot prototype to a 20,000 square foot prototype because, your sales floor now has become more efficient and you're using more technology and robotics and you don't need as many checkout lanes, whatever the case is. And you got to start looking like things like sales per square foot and things like the overall performance that you're going to get out of these stores. They have to be looked at, in that bigger picture and not just in isolation, right?
All right, so we're almost out of time here. I'm going to ask you to prognosticate a bit. What do you see as major trends or innovations that you think are going to shape retail moving forward?
The biggest thing that I've been harping on lately is the AI hype and therefore the technology hype versus the customer experience. And so, we talked earlier about experiential and kind of that boom, especially post-COVID. But I'm also seeing where technology is having both positive and negative effects. I mean, we've all been to a store where it's self-checkout, and 9 times out of 10 you gotta end up calling the person over because something didn't go right, and that experience gets kind of downgraded in your mind, right? And some of the technology in store where now you don't have, like, I go to Home Depot, I can't find anybody anymore to help me. You got to push buttons and look at it yourself online. And so as stores look to become more efficient, they got to balance the technology versus the customer service and the customer experience. And so I've seen these stores like a Brooks Brothers who have had a resurgence from a retail perspective because you walk in and the service is impeccable and it's human to human service and it's unbelievable. And then you see the other side of that where you see Amazon, right, who has had that just walk out technology, and they did all these Amazon Go's and the Amazon Freshes, and the technology really didn't resonate with everybody like they thought it would, the smart carts and the this and the that. And so they've had to tone it down a little bit, and they still try to bring in the technology, but a lot of it isn't being adopted like they want. And so I think this balance of how much technology you need in retail to how much of the experience still needs to be there, human to human, is going to be really interesting to watch over the next 3 to 5 years because it's changing so quickly. And I think you hesitate to invest because as soon as you invest in a certain technology, something else has already come along and and change the game. So it's going to be really interesting to me to watch that dynamic. And the other thing is just to watch how long the treasure hunt continues with the discounters. How long does that? They've been on a roll for years, just years and years and years. You keep hearing about these, these discounters, and forget the economy for a minute. It was before the economy was even, the uncertainty was even an issue. It was the discount and the thrill of the treasure hunt. Then it became more necessity because of wanting to bargain shop and things like that. I'm kind of curious as to how long this continues and how, and the success of these, because they are just killing it
Right. Although, depending on where their goods are from, who knows about the tariff implications on that as well. But that's a whole other topic we'll have to save for another episode. Well, in any event, this has been a lot of fun, Greg. I really appreciate your insights here. And want to thank everybody for joining us. Please like this episode and comment and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and anywhere else where you get podcasts. And I will also remind everybody, if you don't know about it, we have a new 25-minute podcast segment, which is called 5x5 with CompStack, where we chat with top brokers and experts in commercial real estate to do a deep dive into what they're seeing in specific markets. And the first one, which I believe was just recorded, maybe it's live already, I don't know, is focused on Atlanta office. And then we're heading to San Francisco to talk about data centers. So thank you, everybody, and see you next time.